Today, video games are a large part of popular culture in many countries. It's hard to believe it's been about 60 years since an idea for something interactive on a television screen was first thought of. In this documentary, we will cover the history and communicative impact of video games. In 1949, a young engineer named Ralph Baer is given an assignment to build quote-unquote the best TV in the world. He suggests adding an interactive game to the TV set, but this idea is rejected by the management. 7 years later, with the help of Bob Trimbley and Bob Solomon, he is ready to demonstrate a system that allows dots to be moved around a TV screen. 1 year later, in 1967, he puts technician Bill Harrison to work on the first multi-game unit, featuring chase games, where the goal was to move one dot to another and make it disappear, a light gun game, and various other simple games. Before we move on, we should glance upon 1961 when MIT student Steve Russell creates Space War, the very first video game. It becomes popular among most programmers of the time, later spawning a less popular arcade version. Now, on to one of the most important years in video game history, 1972. Nolan Bushnell establishes the company Atari, the name being the Japanese equivalent of Czech. The first game released is Pong, and is named this because of two reasons. The first being ping pong was already a copyrighted trademark, and pong being the sound the ball makes when it hits the paddle. Pong became an instant hit at the arcades, mainly because of its mindless and simple gameplay kept drunk patrons at bay. With an advancement in graphics and overall function, during the early 1980s the two main contenders were the Intellivision and the Atari 2600. Both had a wide variety of games, Intellivision being the best overall, however. Then, the gaming scene is shaken once again in 1986 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System nationwide, packaged with one controller and Super Mario Bros. It becomes an instant hit. Sega counters Nintendo's release with their Sega Master System within the same year. Hideo Kojima, one of the most influential game makers of all time, began his saga during this time period. After discovering the NES, he searched for a job at one of the many game companies in Japan. Konami hired him, but put him to work on the less gaming-wise popular machine, the MSX home computer. Although this was a setback, he used this to his advantage to create several great games such as Snatcher and Metal Gear 1 and 2. Already evident in these games was Kojima's fascination with American culture, an example being the artwork of Solid Snake from the Metal Gear MSX game cover was based off of Kyle Reese from the 1984 film The Terminator, as evident in this picture. Another trademark of Kojima was subjects of catastrophe and nuclear war. He uses video games as a medium for communicating with the players, and shows greatly in some of his latest works such as Metal Gear Solid 2 for the PlayStation 2. Back to the NES. As several years passed and the number of available games rose higher and higher, serious collectors began to emerge, such as Alexander Lombardi, whose NES collection is shown here. Sega seemed to jump ahead in 1990 with the release of the 16-bit console, Sega Genesis, but not for long. Nintendo releases Super Mario Bros. 3 1 year later, and it becomes the best-selling game of all time with 500 million copies sold. Then another struggle begins between the two companies when the Super Nintendo Entertainment System is released in 1991, along with Super Mario World. Sega releases Sonic the Hedgehog for its Genesis, although most gamers agreeing Mario being the better of the two. Over time, the Super Nintendo would dominate as the better system, with a wider variety of classic games such as F-Zero, Super Metroid, and Final Fantasy II. Sega begins to get its revenge, or at least it seems. It rushes to release Sonic 2 for the holidays, and sells like hotcakes, and begins to look like a problem for Nintendo. After the success of Sonic 2, a new add-on for the Genesis is released, the Sega CD. It is one of the greatest but most misunderstood systems of all time. Several great games were released on it, such as Snatcher, which now sells for an average of $100 on eBay, and Lunar, the Silver Star. However, nobody seems interested at the time, and the Sega CD is dubbed as a failure. Nintendo works with Sony to create a CD drive for the Super Nintendo and almost becomes a reality, but when Sony realizes Nintendo's plan to keep all profits, they cancel and begin to work on their own CD-based console. Congress begins to look upon violence in video games, as they believe it to cause cases of rage and even murder in real life. Here is a reenactment of one of these cases.
You suck!
Many believe games not to be the reason, but that it depends on the person who is actually playing the game. The result of this study creates the ESRB, or the Entertainment Software Rating Board. They require that large symbols be placed on the front cover of every video game to let the public know the recommended age of the player and game content. 1995. The Sony PlayStation is released and does great during the first couple of weeks. Many high-quality games are available at launch, and this pushes it ahead of the Saturn. The Nintendo 64 is then released in 1996 and sells 1.7 million units within 3 months. Fast forwarding to 1999 with the release of the Sega Dreamcast in America. The new system sets records with $98 million made within the first 24 hours. Sony is more than prepared for this. 28 hours before the release of the PlayStation 2 on October 26th of the year 2000, a total of 1,000 people line up in front of Sony's Metreon store in San Francisco. Only half of them actually get a system. Some could argue the form of communication found in video games. Some games are metaphors for real-life situations, like the story of Final Fantasy VII is to defeat the evil Shinra Corporation that is draining the planet of energy just to profit. This could be viewed similar to these industries today that pollute the earth of trash and unwanted garbage. Mentioned earlier, Hideo Kojima puts various themes into his games. In his Metal Gear series, many people, like Artemio Urbina, say the whole theme is of keeping the world together and passing your genes on to your children, and how this defines us today. They can also help with many situations such as improving eye-hand coordination, which in turn helps people communicate easier after being helped. Online playable games are a major portion of the communication society. People from all over the world can talk and play games together, regardless of language, culture, religion, and distance apart when they use software and the internet. Such games that people have played for thousands of years can now be shared with others and enjoyed together, such as Mahjong and chess. Games could be better than movies, whereas a movie is something that is given to you for you to interpret, and video games give you this universe that could be a reflection of society or something thought of in the brain of a programmer that we make into something satisfactory that we feel okay with. It is up to us to take this and embrace it what it is presented to us. This is the key.